There is a story. An old man sits outside the gates of Constantinople with a wooden bowl in his hands. He is blind. He cannot see the people walking past him. He cannot see the city that rises behind him, the walls he once defended, the streets he once rode through in triumph. Someone has written words on a piece of cloth beside him. Give a coin to Belisarius, whom fortune raised high, whom envy has destroyed. Painters loved this story. In 1780, Jacques Louis David put it on canvas. A soldier in the crowd recognizes the old beggar, and his face breaks open with something between horror and grief. The painting traveled across Europe. It became one of the defining images of what happens when power throws away the people who built it. There is one problem. It almost certainly never happened. The historical record does not support it. The story appears centuries after Belisarius died, in sources far removed from the actual events. That blindness may have been temporary. The begging almost certainly never occurred. So why does the story refuse to die? Why has it survived for over 1,000 years? Through medieval chronicles and Renaissance paintings and Enlightenment novels, carried forward by people who had never read a single page of Byzantine history. Because it feels true, not factually true, emotionally true. It feels like the right ending for a man who gave everything to a system that was never quite sure it wanted him. And that feeling, that gut-level recognition of something deeply unfair, is what this story is actually about. By the time we finish, you will understand exactly why that ending feels inevitable. Not because it happened, because of the life he actually lived. Constantinople, the year 520. Stand in this city on a clear morning, and you are standing inside the most carefully maintained illusion in the world. The harbour is full of ships. The markets are loud and crowded. The churches going up on every hill are bigger than anything the city has seen before. From the inside, this looks like a civilization at its absolute peak. From the outside, if you know where to look, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like a man in expensive clothes, standing in front of a house that has partially burned down, telling everyone who walks by that the house is fine, that the smoke smell is normal, that the burned wing was never really part of the house anyway. The house is the Roman Empire. The burned wing is everything west of the Adriatic Sea. Here is what happened. In the year 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer removed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire from his throne. The emperor's name was Romulus Augustulus, which was, under the circumstances, almost unbearably ironic. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, Augustus, the title of the first emperor, both names, on the last one, as if history were making a joke that only becomes funny much later. The Western Empire was gone. In its place, across territory that had been Roman for 5 or 6 centuries, new kingdoms were taking shape. The Vandals held North Africa. The Ostrogoths were moving into Italy. The Visigoths had Hispania. The Franks were consolidating Gaul. These were not the disorganized tribal groups that Roman legions had spent centuries pushing back along the Rhine and Danube. They had absorbed enough of Roman civilization to govern. They used Roman administrative systems. Some of them used Roman law. They called themselves kings rather than emperors. But the kingdoms they built were not entirely un-Roman either. They were something new, something that did not have a name yet. In Constantinople, the official position was that this was temporary. The empire never said it had lost the West. The empire said the West was experiencing a period of disorder, and that in due time Rome would be restored. The emperors in Constantinople kept calling themselves Roman emperors. They kept the old titles. They kept the old ceremonies. The sense of who they believed themselves to be remained completely intact. We are Roman. This is what Romans do. Rome will be again what Rome was. There was a scholar in one of Constantinople's great libraries during this period. He spent his days copying manuscripts, because manuscripts deteriorated, and if no one copied them, the words inside them would eventually crumble into nothing. His job was preservation. He did not think about it much. He copied what he was given and moved to the next document. But sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the light came through the window at the angle that turned the dust golden, he would stop and look at what he held. A letter from a Roman official in Carthage, written 100 years ago, describing a trade dispute, a census record from a province now governed by someone who did not speak Latin, a military communique from a garrison that no longer existed. The world these documents described was gone, not ancient gone, the way the pharaohs were gone, recently gone. His grandfather's generation had still lived in that world. The men who wrote these letters had believed, when they wrote them, that the world they described would continue forever. He set the letter down, picked up his pen, went back to work. There was nothing else to do. This was Constantinople in 520, a genuine, great city, sophisticated, wealthy, militarily powerful, a city with every reason to see itself as the center of the world, a city that had also, if you looked honestly at the maps, lost about half of what it considered itself the center of, and somewhere in the complicated machinery of the imperial administration, a young man from a province that nobody in the old Rome had ever cared much about had recently arrived in the capital. He came from Thrace. He had come because the capital was where things happened. He was about to become the instrument through which the city's oldest and deepest fantasy would almost come true. His name was Belisarius, and the world he walked into was a world that had been telling itself the same story for 50 years, waiting for someone capable enough to try to make it real. That was the beginning of his glory. It was also the beginning of everything that followed. Thrace is not a place that produces emperors. It produces soldiers. The distinction matters more than it might seem. Emperors come from families that have been close to power long enough to absorb it as a natural condition of their existence. They think of authority the way other people think of furniture. It is simply there when you walk into the room. Soldiers come from somewhere else, from the edges, from the places where the empire shows up, not as culture and philosophy and the elegant machinery of governance, but as roads, tax collectors, and the occasional legion passing through. Thrace was that kind of place. It ran along the western shore of the Black Sea and inland toward the Danube, a landscape of hills and farmland, productive enough to support a population, but not dramatic enough to attract attention from people who had other options. The cities were smaller than Constantinople and understood themselves to be smaller. Everyone who grew up there knew, from an early age, that the important things happened somewhere else. For a certain kind of person, that knowledge is paralyzing. For another kind, it is fuel. We do not know much about Belisarius's childhood. The sources that describe his later life in careful detail are thin about his early years, which is typical for people who become important later rather than being born into importance. What we know is that he came from a family of sufficient standing to receive a proper education and enter imperial service, but not so elevated that his position was guaranteed, regardless of what he did. He had to earn it. By the time he appears clearly in the historical record, he is already in the service of Justinian, who was, at that point, not yet emperor, but the ambitious and capable nephew of an aging one. This is how careers of this kind worked in Constantinople. You attached yourself to someone going up, and you went up with them. The quality of your judgment about who was going up was itself a form of intelligence. Attaching yourself to Justinian was good judgment. What the later record allows us to infer about the young man from Thrace is this. He had an unusual quality of attention. Not the attention of someone performing interest while actually thinking about something else. Real attention. The kind that makes people feel, when you ask them a question, that you actually want to know the answer. He listened in a world full of people who were waiting for their turn to speak. He built models of situations in his head, not just of the immediate problem, but of the second and third things the problem would produce. He was always calculating what came after, and he understood, from the beginning, that the system he was entering was something he had to understand completely before he could operate inside it effectively. He was not born into it. He could not take it for granted. So he paid attention to every detail of how it actually worked, as opposed to how it was supposed to work, which in Constantinople were often very different things. There was an older officer in the military administration of the capital, a man who had spent decades processing the practical details of imperial campaigns. He had seen many young officers come through. He could usually tell, within a few conversations, what kind of commander he was dealing with. Belisarius puzzled him. The skills were there, the tactical thinking, the physical capability, the instinctive grasp of logistics that separated the good officers from the ones who got their men killed through carelessness. But there was something else. When this young man from Thrace asked about supply routes or garrison strengths, he was not filling in a checklist. He was building something, some larger picture that the questions were feeding. The older officer thought about this sometimes. A commander who was always building the larger picture would know things, and knowing things, in a place like Constantinople, moved in directions you could not always predict. He filed the observation away and went back to his work. In 527, the Emperor Justin died, and Justinian took the throne. The dream of restoring Rome was no longer one man's private ambition. It was now imperial policy. It had the resources of the empire behind it. It had the administrative machinery. It had the military. It needed someone to execute it. Justinian knew who that was. He had known for some time. The question that neither of them could have answered that first year was what the execution would cost. Not in gold, not in soldiers, though both costs would be staggering. What it would cost in the currencies that do not appear in any treasury report: trust, certainty, the ability to believe, without reservation, that the man fighting your wars is fighting them entirely for you. That question would take 40 years to answer, and when the answer finally came, it would be one of the most painful things either of them ever had to understand about power and the people who wield it. There is a mosaic in Ravenna, Italy, that has been staring at visitors for nearly 1,500 years. It shows Justinian at the center of a group of courtiers and church officials, frozen in the particular stillness that Byzantine art preferred for its most important subjects. He is wearing purple. He is carrying a golden bowl. The men around him are positioned to communicate through the careful geometry of where they stand, exactly how much less important they are than the person at the center. He looks certain, not powerful in the aggressive sense, not dangerous in any visible way. Certain. the kind of certainty that belongs to people who have decided, at some fundamental level, that the universe is organized in a way that justifies their place within it. Across the same church, in the opposite apse, is a companion mosaic. It shows Theodora. She is wearing purple too, and a crown heavy with jewels. But the expression on her face is the most interesting thing in the room. It is not the same certainty as Justinian's. It is something more watchful, the expression of someone who has learned that certainty is a performance, that the universe is not organized in any way that particularly justifies anyone's place within it, and that the people who understand this are better equipped to survive than the people who do not. These two mosaics, facing each other across a church in northern Italy, tell you more about the world Belisarius operated in than most of the written sources. Justinian was born around 482 to a peasant family in the Balkans. His uncle Justin had left that same poverty to join the army, had risen through decades of service to become a senior officer, and had then, through a combination of genuine ability and the specific accidents of succession politics, become emperor in 518. Justinian came to Constantinople to be educated and to be useful to an uncle who had power but limited formal education. He was useful in the way that only genuinely intelligent people can be useful, by making himself indispensable through competence rather than connection. By the time Justin died and Justinian took the throne, he had spent roughly 20 years at the center of imperial power without formally holding it. He understood its mechanisms with the intimacy of an engineer who has spent 2 decades maintaining a machine he is finally being allowed to operate. What he wanted to do with it was enormous. The legal reforms alone would have been a life's work for most rulers. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the systematic reorganization of Roman law that Justinian commissioned and drove to completion, was one of the most consequential intellectual projects in Western history. It would shape legal systems across Europe for the next 1,000 years. It required coordinating dozens of scholars across years of sustained effort, making thousands of difficult editorial decisions, holding a project of extraordinary complexity together against every pressure that bureaucracies generate to make ambitious projects fail. Justinian did this while simultaneously managing an empire, fighting wars on multiple frontiers, navigating a court full of people with their own ambitions, and pursuing what he considered his primary mission, getting Rome back. He slept, by contemporary accounts, very little. He worked through the night regularly. He was not physically imposing. He was not the kind of figure who commanded a room through presence. What he had instead was a quality of sustained intellectual energy that people who encountered it found either inspiring or exhausting, depending on whether they were required to keep up with it. He also had Theodora. Theodora's origins were so different from the world she ended up inhabiting that they still feel, reading about them 15 centuries later, like a novelist's invention rather than a historical fact. She was born, probably around 500, to a family connected to the entertainment world of Constantinople. She grew up in the world of the circus and the theatre, in networks of performers and their patrons that occupied a position in Byzantine society that was simultaneously central and stigmatized. Performers were everywhere. They were also, officially, beneath the dignity of respectable society. She was an actress. She performed in ways that, in the social codes of the time, placed her firmly outside the boundaries of what was considered marriageable for a man of Justinian's standing. There were laws, specifically, against a man of senatorial rank marrying a woman of her background Justinian changed the laws. What this tells you about Justinian is something important. He was not a man who accepted categories as permanent simply because they existed. He looked at categories and asked whether they were necessary. And if he decided they were not, he changed them. This was a useful quality in an emperor attempting to reorganize Roman law and restore Roman territory. It was a more complicated quality in a husband. What Theodora brought to the partnership was more practically valuable than anything Justinian could have married into through a conventional dynastic alliance. She understood power from the opposite direction he did. Justinian understood it from the administrative side, from the perspective of someone who had spent decades learning how institutions worked. He knew the rules. He knew how decisions moved through the hierarchy. He knew which levers to pull and what they would move. Theodora understood it from the other side, from the perspective of someone who had spent decades on the wrong side of those institutions and had learned, with the close attention that survival requires, exactly how they actually operated versus how they were supposed to operate. She saw the performances behind the performances. She knew which alliances were real and which were maintained only as long as they were convenient. She knew who owed what to whom, and what those debts would cost when they were called in. Together, they were formidable in a way that neither was alone. And between the two of them, they were the entire environment within which Belisarius would operate for the rest of his life. This was the world Belisarius was entering. Now here is the thing about that world that matters most for understanding what happened to him over the following decades. Theodora had a friend. The friend's name was Antonina. Antonina had come from the entertainment world too. She was older than Theodora, had been married before, had children from previous relationships. She was, in the social categories of the time, not the obvious wife for the empire's most promising military commander. She became Belisarius's wife anyway. Whether this happened because of the Theodora connection or before it, whether Belisarius married her for love or for the political reality she represented, or for some combination of reasons that does not reduce cleanly to either, is something the sources do not resolve. What Procopius would later write about Antonina in his secret history is something we will return to, because that text requires careful handling. What we can say now is this: Antonina understood the court in the way that only an outsider who has become an insider ever fully understands it. She had not been born into it. She had not absorbed it as the natural condition of her existence. She had watched it, studied it, learnt its actual rules rather than its stated ones. She understood that the court did not pause simply because the army had left Constantinople. The politics did not pause. The alliances did not pause. The scrutiny that Justinian applied to everything Belisarius did not pause. Someone who understood those politics needed to be close to the man the politics were watching. She was that person. Many retellings of Belisarius's story reduce Antonina to a problem, a complication, a dangerous variable in an otherwise heroic narrative. That reading misses something important. Belisarius was brilliant on the battlefield. He understood logistics and tactics and the psychology of soldiers in ways that very few commanders in any era have matched. What he understood less well was the court, not the formal structure of it. The informal structure, the question of who actually mattered to whom, and what the obligations were, and where the real lines of loyalty and hostility ran underneath the official ones. Antonina understood this. She had grown up in a world where understanding it was a condition of survival. There was a servant in Antonina's household, a woman who had been with her for several years and who travelled with her through the campaigns that followed. She was good at her job, which was a combination of practical management and the kind of close observation that proximity to powerful people produces over time. She watched Antonina prepare for the African expedition with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this kind of preparation before and knew what it actually required. She noticed that Antonina was not afraid. Not that she was pretending. She genuinely was not afraid. She was thinking about practical things, contacts, the social landscape of the campaign ahead, which relationships would need to be managed and in which direction, the risks that could be mitigated and the ones that had to be accepted. The servant thought, this woman has already decided how this is going to go. She was right. In 527, Justinian was crowned. All the pieces were in place. The emperor with his dream, the empress with her intelligence, the general with his capability, the general's wife, who understood the world, the general did not fully see. The only thing none of them could calculate was the price. This is always the thing no one can calculate. The Persian frontier, in 530, was the kind of place that clarified things. It clarified them in the way that difficult circumstances always clarify things. By removing the layers of comfort and performance and assumption that people accumulate when their environment allows it, and leaving behind whatever was actually there underneath. Some people, when the layers came off, turned out to be smaller than they appeared. Belisarius turned out to be exactly what he appeared to be, which was already, by this point, quite a lot. The Sassanid Persian Empire was the only power in the known world that the Byzantine state genuinely respected as an equal. It had to. Persia had been a serious military and political force for centuries, with its own sophisticated administration, its own cultural confidence, its own understanding of itself as the natural organizing principle of the world east of the Euphrates. The two empires had been fighting, negotiating, and fighting again across a contested frontier for so long that the relationship had taken on the quality of a permanent condition rather than a temporary dispute. In 530, the Persians moved into Byzantine territory under a commander named Perozes, with a force that substantially outnumbered what Belisarius had available. The battle took place near the fortress city of Dara, in what is now southeastern Turkey. Military historians have spent centuries analyzing what Belisarius did there. The careful selection of terrain, the arrangement of his forces to compensate for his numerical disadvantage, the timing of his cavalry movements, all of it is real and worth understanding. But the more revealing thing about Dara is not what happened during the battle. It is what happened before it, and what happened after. Before the battle, Belisarius talked to his soldiers. This sounds unremarkable. Commanders talked to their soldiers. But there is a difference between addressing soldiers and actually communicating with them. The difference is whether you are telling them what you want them to do or helping them understand why it matters. Belisarius was consistently, throughout his career, doing the second thing. He explained his thinking. He told his men what he expected the enemy to do and why he had arranged his response the way he had. He made them participants in his reasoning rather than simply recipients of his orders. Soldiers who understand a plan can adapt when reality does not match the plan. And reality almost never matches the plan. An army that knows what it is trying to accomplish can make intelligent adjustments. An army that is just following orders freezes when the orders stop applying. After the battle, Belisarius did something that surprised everyone around him. He stopped the pursuit. The Persians were retreating. The Byzantine cavalry wanted to run them down. This was standard practice. You won. You pursued. You turned a victory into a rout. This was how it worked. Belisarius called them back. He gave 3 reasons. First, his cavalry was tired and a pursuit against a still organized force was dangerous. Second, the victory was sufficient. He had accomplished what he needed to accomplish. Third, and this is the reason that people remembered, he said he did not want to massacre men who were no longer a military threat. Procopius, who recorded this, presents it as a practical decision, and it was practical. An army that does not massacre retreating enemies tends to face enemies who are more willing to surrender the next time, which is militarily useful. Populations that watch your soldiers show restraint tend to be more cooperative, which is logistically useful. But something in the specificity of that third reason, stated plainly by a commander to his officers, pointed at something beyond pure calculation. There was a Hunnic cavalry officer in Belisarius's force that day, a man who had been fighting in various imperial and semi-imperial capacities for nearly 20 years. He had served under commanders who stopped pursuits because they were afraid of overextending. He had served under commanders who stopped them because they were thinking about future negotiations. He had not served under a commander who stopped one, in part because of something that looked from the outside like it might be, improbably, a matter of principle. He filed this observation away. He was not sure what to do with it yet. When the report of Dara reached Constantinople, Justinian was pleased. He wrote a warm letter of congratulation. But the letter contained something that Belisarius read carefully. A question about the number of prisoners taken. A question about what had happened to the Persian supply train. The kind of questions that were not just requests for information. They were, if you read them with attention, a form of assessment. Justinian was measuring something. He was measuring not just what had been won, but what kind of winner Belisarius was. Whether he was the kind of man who pressed advantage to its absolute limit, or the kind who stopped when he judged the goal accomplished. The letter did not say what Justinian made of the answer. What it did say was that greater things were being considered, that the work on the eastern frontier had been noted, that there were conversations happening in Constantinople that Belisarius would soon be part of. Belisarius set the letter down. He looked at the frontier he had just defended. He thought about what greater things meant. He thought about what would be required of a man to whom greater things were being offered. He did not know yet that the qualities that had defined Dara, the restraint, the second-order thinking, the refusal to turn victory into something uglier than it needed to be, would be precisely the qualities that made him both indispensable and dangerous to the empire he was about to save, again and again and again. The frontier was quiet. For now, something much larger was waiting. And it was waiting not outside the walls of Constantinople, it was waiting inside them. Constantinople, January, 532. The city is on fire, not metaphorically. The fires started near the hippodrome and spread through the night into the surrounding neighborhoods. And by the fifth day, they have consumed portions of the city that took generations to build. The great church that stood before the Hagia Sophia we know today is gone. The Chalca Gate, the ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace, is damaged. Entire blocks of the most densely populated city in the Western world are ash and smoke, and the particular smell that cities make when they are destroying themselves. The word, "the rioters are shouting," is Nika. It means victory. To understand what that word means right now, you need to understand the hippodrome. The hippodrome was not a sports venue. In Constantinople, it was the primary space where the relationship between the emperor and the people was performed and negotiated. The chariot races were the mechanism through which that relationship was expressed. The blues and the greens, the two major racing factions, were organizations with deep roots in the city's social and economic life. With their own internal hierarchies and their own long list of grievances against whoever was currently in power, they hated each other. They had always hated each other. But in January of 532, they did something that had almost never happened before. They agreed. Specifically, they agreed that they had common grievances against Justinian's government. Common enough to set aside the factional rivalry that was the organizing principle of their public lives. The spark was the botched execution of 7 convicted criminals from both factions. Men whose sentences had been carried out so incompetently that 2 of them survived and the situation had descended into bureaucratic chaos. When Justinian refused to address this at the races, the crowd's anger moved from the normal theatrical expression of displeasure into something different, something that built for 5 days. By the time we reach the point that matters for this story, the Hippodrome has become the center of a revolt that is no longer about 7 prisoners. Senior senators and faction leaders have produced an alternative emperor. His name was Hypatius. He was the nephew of a previous emperor, which gave him the bloodline. He was not particularly capable or ambitious, which made him useful to the people around him who were both. He was dragged into the Hippodrome and crowned with a gold chain, someone removed from their own neck. And the crowd roared. In the palace, Justinian was preparing to flee. Ships were being loaded. The plan, as best as anyone can reconstruct it, was to retreat to Thrace, to regroup somewhere the mob could not reach, to figure out from safety what came next. It was a reasonable plan in the sense that it preserved his physical survival. It was a catastrophic plan in every other sense. Theodora stopped him. Procopius records what she said. And while the exact words are certainly a reconstruction, the substance is not in dispute. She said she would not flee. She said that imperial purple made a fine burial shroud. She said she could not live without the crown and did not intend to try. She told him to stay. He stayed. And then someone had to go into the Hippodrome. Belisarius and a commander named Mundus went in from different entrances with soldiers behind them. The crowd inside numbered in the tens of thousands. The crowd had been there for days. It had committed to something and could not easily uncommit. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre. The sources disagree on the number. Some say 30,000. Others say less. Ancient and medieval numbers are almost always unreliable in both directions. What is not in dispute is that a very large number of people died inside the Hippodrome that day. Most of them were not soldiers. Most of them were not armed in any meaningful sense. Most of them were people who had come to the races days earlier, had stayed for the riot, and found themselves trapped in an enclosed space when armed men came through the exits. Belisarius commanded one of those forces. Afterward, he did not write about it. No record survives of him discussing it with anyone. No reflection, no justification, no visible attempt to process what had happened or fit it into the framework of the man who had stopped a pursuit at Dara because he did not want to massacre men who were no longer a threat. That silence is its own kind of record. And this is the thing the silence points at. There is a woman in the crowd near the Hippodrome's outer gate on the day it happens. She is a food vendor. She has been trying for 2 days to get her cart away from the area. But the streets have been blocked, and the situation has kept changing in ways that have made every route impassable. She is not a faction member. She is not a revolutionary. She is a person with a cart of food and an extremely strong desire to be somewhere else. She presses herself against the gate when the soldiers come through. She does not look at their faces. She looks at the ground and counts her own heartbeats, and she waits. The sounds around her are not sounds she has words for. She has lived in Constantinople her whole life, in a city that has sounds for everything. These sounds have no place in her vocabulary. When it is over and the gate opens, she pushes her cart into the street and walks away without looking back. She does not speak about it afterward. Not to her family, not to her neighbors. She has a business to run and a life that requires her to function. And the functioning requires not carrying certain things in the foreground where they get in the way. She is very good at that. She has lived in Constantinople long enough to learn that this skill is not optional. Now, there is something that happens in Belisarius that night, after it is over, that no source records, and that we can only approach through what we know of the man. He is alone. The palace is full of people. Justinian receiving reports. Officials organizing the immediate aftermath. The administrative machinery of a saved government beginning to reassemble itself. But Belisarius has stepped away from all of it, into a courtyard or a corridor, or whatever space the palace offers to a man who needs a moment outside the noise. He sits with what he has done. He is not a man who avoided difficult truths about himself. His entire career demonstrates the opposite. He looked at situations as they actually were, not as he wished them to be, because looking clearly was the only way to operate effectively. That quality applied, now, to this day, to what his soldiers did and what his orders made possible, produces something that has no administrative resolution. He did not choose the Nika revolt. He did not choose the order. He did not choose the terms under which the only available response was the one that was chosen. All of that is true. He was also the one who walked through the gate. He sits with this for a long time. Then he stands up. He goes back to work. Because going back to work is what the situation requires and what he knows how to do. And because there is, in the end, no other available response to the things that cannot be undone. But something has shifted. Something small and permanent has been added to the weight of what it means to serve this empire, to serve this emperor, to be the instrument of a power that is capable of this. He does not examine it directly. He carries it. In the palace that same night, Justinian is doing something else. He is thinking about the man who went into the hippodrome when asked. He is thinking about what the events of the last 5 days have demonstrated about that man. Not the act itself, which was what it was, ordered and executed and finished, but what it meant about the relationship. Belisarius had been given an order that was, by any ordinary standard, extraordinary. He had not hesitated. He had not negotiated. He had not found reasons why the order was impractical or outside his area of responsibility. He had done it. This was, from Justinian's perspective, important information. It told him something about the depth of the loyalty he was working with. It told him that the general he was planning to use for the most ambitious military project in a century was someone who, when pushed to the absolute limit, did not push back. Justinian thought about Africa. He thought about what it would mean to send a man like this across the Mediterranean with 15,000 soldiers and the full weight of imperial authorization behind him. He thought about what it would mean if that man succeeded. He thought about what it would mean if that man succeeded too completely, and began to wonder what that capability might eventually cost. There is something most retellings of Belisarius's life get wrong. They treat Antonina as a problem. She appears in the narrative as a complication, a dangerous variable. The woman whose behavior created difficulties for her husband, and whose relationship with Theodora entangled him in court politics he might otherwise have avoided. The primary source for this reading is Procopius's Secret History, which devotes considerable space to painting her as one of the central sources of suffering in Belisarius's life. But here is the thing about the Secret History that any honest reading of it requires you to hold in mind. Procopius wrote 2 books about the same people. In his Wars, the formal history he published during his lifetime, Belisarius is a figure of genuine capability. The campaigns are described with care and seriousness, and the people around him, including Antonina, are treated with the relative balance of a historian trying to be fair. In the Secret History, the same people become something close to monsters. Justinian is an agent of cosmic evil. Theodora is described in terms so vicious that the passages have been suppressed in various editions across the centuries. Antonina is a manipulative woman who controlled her husband through a combination of infidelity and the political leverage that the Theodora connection gave her. We will return to the question of what happened to Procopius, and why a man who travelled with Belisarius through the most difficult campaigns of the age eventually sat down to write the most devastating portrait of him imaginable. That story belongs to a later chapter. For now, what matters is this. Reading Antonina, primarily through the Secret History, is like reading a person's character, primarily through the worst thing their most bitter enemy ever wrote about them. The document is real. The bitterness is real. The specific claims require evidence that the Secret History itself does not provide. So, set it aside for a moment, and look at what the fuller record actually shows. Antonina travelled with Belisarius on campaigns that most wives of senior commanders did not attend. She crossed the Mediterranean to Africa. She was present in Italy through the long years of fighting. She went with him into situations that involved genuine personal risk. Repeatedly, over decades, she had a close friendship with Theodora that was not simply a social connection but an active political resource. At critical moments in Belisarius's career, when accusations from the court threatened to become something irreversible, Antonina's relationship with the Empress made the difference between surviving the crisis and not surviving it. She understood the court in a way that Belisarius did not, and could not easily have developed on his own. Think about what Belisarius's life actually looked like. He spent most of his career on campaign, months and years at a time, in Persia and Africa and Italy, separated from Constantinople by the full width of the empire. He was brilliant at reading military situations. He was skilled at managing soldiers and logistics and the complex human dynamics of a field command. What he was not, by the nature of the life he lived, was immersed in the daily texture of court politics. He did not know, with the instinctive immediacy that only constant proximity develops, which alliances had shifted in the last month, which official had moved closer to Justinian's inner circle, and which had moved further, what the mood in the palace was toward any given situation. Antonina knew these things. She knew them because she had spent her life learning to read environments that would destroy you if you misread them. She came from a world where the social landscape shifted constantly, and where the ability to track those shifts accurately was the difference between a life that worked and one that did not. When she moved into the imperial court, she brought that ability with her and applied it to a new and larger stage. The servant who travelled with Antonina through the African and Italian campaigns observed her mistress across years of close proximity. She watched her prepare for the expedition to Africa with the focused calm of someone who had already run the calculation and knew her role in what was coming. She was not going to Africa to watch. She was going because she understood. with a clarity that perhaps even Belisarius did not fully share. That the court did not stop watching simply because the army had left Constantinople. Every dispatch Belisarius sent back would be read in a specific political context. Every victory he won would be processed by people who had their own interests in how that victory was interpreted and who received the credit for it. Someone who understood those people needed to be present in that conversation. There is a letter that Antonina wrote to Theodora during the African campaign. The letter itself has not survived, but its existence and rough content can be inferred from subsequent events. It was not a personal letter. It was a political one, describing the situation in North Africa in terms that would be useful to the empress and that would keep Belisarius's interests present in the palace while he was thousands of miles away winning battles. This is what Antonina was doing, not sabotaging him, supporting him in the specific way that the specific world they lived in required support to be offered. Justinian's court was not a meritocracy where talent produced recognition through transparent processes. It was a system of competing interests and personal loyalties and the constant background pressure of a ruler who was brilliant and capable, and also capable of destroying people he had trusted for decades when he decided they had become inconvenient. In that system, what protected you was not your record. Your record was necessary but not sufficient. What protected you was relationships. Antonina maintained the relationships. The fleet departed Constantinople in the summer of 533. 500 ships, 15,000 soldiers. An ambition that most people who knew anything about military history considered somewhere between very dangerous and genuinely insane. The last Roman attempt to retake North Africa from the Vandals, mounted in 468, had ended in catastrophic failure. That was within living memory. Belisarius stood on the dock as the ships were loaded. Antonina was already aboard. She was not going because she had no choice. She was going because she had made a calculation about what was necessary and what her role in it was. And the calculation had produced this answer. Behind them, Constantinople continued its business. Justinian worked through the night on legal reforms. Theodora managed the correspondence that required managing. The court performed its daily rituals of access and negotiation. Ahead of them, Africa. Ahead of them, the first real test of whether the dream of restoration was something that could be translated from Justinian's sleepless nights into actual events in the actual world. Belisarius looked at the open water and thought about what he knew and what he did not know. He had planned for everything he could plan for. What he could not plan for was the moment when reality turned out to be different from every version of reality he had imagined. That moment was always coming. It was always coming. In every situation he had ever been in. He had learned, over the years, that the quality of a person was not visible in the easy moments. The water was smooth. The wind was behind them. For now, the Mediterranean in summer does something to light that photographs never quite capture. It flattens the horizon, turns the water a color that sits between blue and green without fully committing to either. The sky above it is harder and cleaner than sky anywhere else. The kind of sky that makes distances feel both larger and more precise than they actually are. Ships moving across it look like they are moving across a painting of water rather than water itself. The fleet of 500 ships carrying Belisarius and 15,000 soldiers moved through this light for 9 days before reaching Sicily, where they stopped to take on water and collect intelligence. What the intelligence showed was this. The Vandal king Gelimer had recently sent a substantial portion of his naval forces to Sardinia to deal with a rebellion. The Vandal fleet The force that would have met them at sea and made the landing a catastrophic fight before a single soldier set foot on African soil was somewhere else. The window was open. Belisarius made a decision that several of his senior officers thought was too aggressive. He would land his forces not as close to Carthage as possible, which would have been faster, but at a point roughly 9 days' march from the city. He wanted space. He wanted the march to happen while Gelimer was still organizing his response, before the Vandal fleet returned, before the tactical situation closed around them. Speed was now everything. Then he did something that stopped his officers cold. He issued orders about how his soldiers were to behave toward the local population. The orders were specific. His men were not to take food from farms without paying for it. They were not to damage property. They were not to treat the people they encountered as enemies or as subjects of a territory being conquered. They were to treat them as Romans, as people being restored to the empire from which they had been separated. There were practical reasons. An army moving through unfamiliar territory needed food, and food in that territory was going to come from the local population voluntarily or not come at all. Seizing it by force would require detaching soldiers from the march. Intelligence about enemy movements came from people who trusted you. People who feared you hid, and their hiding was its own form of deception. But the third reason was the one that was harder to put into an order. He believed that how an army behaved was an argument the army was making to everyone watching. He was not simply trying to avoid alienating a population. He was trying to demonstrate, through the actual behavior of 15,000 soldiers under difficult conditions, that Byzantine authority meant something different from Vandal authority, that the restoration being enacted was not simply a transfer of power from one set of armed men to another. Whether the populations of North Africa experienced the Byzantine arrival the way Belisarius intended is something the sources only partially answer. What they do record is that as the army moved north toward Carthage, food was available. People did not fight back, and information about Vandal movements was provided by people who had reasons to provide it. The system worked. There was a farmer whose land sat alongside the road the army was using. He had lived on this land his entire life. His father had lived on it. His grandfather had stories about what the land was like before the Vandals came. Stories told so many times, they had become mythology rather than memory. He watched the army come. He knew what armies sounded like. He knew the rhythm of thousands of men moving, the way the ground registered the weight before you could see anything. He knew what Vandal forces meant for a farm in their path. He waited. The soldiers moved through his land and took nothing. One of them, a young man from somewhere in the east, stopped at his well and asked, in halting Latin mixed with Greek, if he could draw water. He asked. He did not take. He stood at the edge of the well and waited for the answer. The farmer said yes. The soldier drew the water, drank some, and carried some in a vessel he had with him. He thanked the farmer in the same mixed-up language and rejoined the column. The farmer stood by his well for a long time after the army had passed. He had not expected that. He did not arrive at any large political conclusion. He was not a political person. He had a farm and a family, and the practical concerns of a person whose survival was determined primarily by weather and by what people with weapons chose to do. He could not evaluate Byzantine claims about Roman legitimacy or Justinian's theological arguments about the nature of his authority over North Africa. He could evaluate the fact that the soldier had asked, that story moved through the farming communities along the road faster than the army itself was moving. Not as a story about politics, as a story about asking, in a place where armies took what they wanted as a matter of course, a story about asking, was a story about something different. Gelimer was badly out of position when the Byzantine army reached the outskirts of Carthage. He assembled his forces and moved to intercept. And the battle that followed at a place called Ad Decimum, 9 miles from the city, was over faster than anyone expected. The combination of cavalry, timing, and the simple advantage of an enemy still organizing his response while you are already executing yours produced a collapse that left Gelimer in flight before the day was done. Carthage opened its gates that evening. Belisarius rode in and went directly to the palace that Gelimer had occupied. Procopius was with him and recorded what they found. The dining table was set. The food was still there. The wine was still poured. Gelimer's dinner sat on the table exactly as it had been arranged before the news arrived that the battle was lost and the city was gone. He had left in such haste that the meal was still on the table, still warm, still waiting for someone to sit down and eat it. Belisarius sat down. He ate Gelimer's food at Gelimer's table, while Gelimer was somewhere in the countryside. Running, Procopius recorded the moment without extensive commentary. He did not need to. The image said what it said. The table set for a king who was no longer king. The general of a distant emperor eating the meal meant for the man he had just replaced. The sheer physical fact of it, the interrupted ordinariness of a dinner abandoned at the exact moment of catastrophic loss. The secondary battle at Tricomarum in December of 533 finished the job. Gelimer's brother was killed early in the fighting, which broke the Vandal formation. Gelimer fled again, this time into the mountains of northwestern Africa, where he held out for several months before surrendering in the spring of 534. The Vandal kingdom was over, a kingdom that had existed for 100 years, that had sacked Rome in 455, that had held North Africa against every previous attempt to dislodge it, was gone. In less than a year, with a force that was outnumbered on paper by the forces it defeated. When the reports reached Constantinople, Justinian added new titles to his name: Justinian, Vandalicus, Africanus. The territories were his. The gold of the Vandal treasury, including treasures that had been taken from Rome generations earlier, was being shipped back to the capital. He was very pleased. He was also, in the specific way that intelligent and watchful people are pleased by things that are larger than they expected, something else, not suspicious yet, not in any way that was visible or that could be pointed to in a document, but watchful. Belisarius had done what no Roman general had managed in 70 years. He had reconquered a lost province. He had done it faster and more completely than anyone predicted. He had done it while maintaining the kind of discipline that made the populations of the conquered territory something closer to relieved than resentful. He had done it through his own strategic thinking, his own tactical decisions, his own authority, exercised over his own army. He had won in a way that was going to be very difficult to take credit for without also crediting the man who had actually done it. Justinian worked through the night, as he always did. Belisarius wrote his reports, as he always did. In the reports, he used the correct language. The victories belonged to Justinian's reign. The emperor's wisdom had made the campaign possible. He gave the credit in exactly the form that the political reality required. He meant it. This is the thing that cannot be emphasized enough. He was not performing humility. He genuinely understood himself as the instrument of imperial policy. His victories were the empire's victories. He had not done this for himself. But there is a problem with being a very effective instrument. Instruments of sufficient quality develop a reputation that attaches to the instrument rather than to the hand holding it. The people in North Africa knew who had taken their city. They knew the name Belisarius in the way that people know the name of the person who actually showed up when everything was difficult. Not the name of the person who authorized the showing up from a comfortable distance. This was not a problem yet. It was the beginning of one, and somewhere in Constantinople, in the careful and exhausting intelligence that Justinian brought to everything he thought about, the beginning was being noted. Rome invented the triumph, not the feeling, the ceremony, the specific ritual by which a general who had won a sufficiently significant military victory was permitted to enter the city in a procession, with his soldiers behind him, his prisoners before him, the spoils of the campaign displayed for the population to see, and a slave beside him in the chariot, whispering into his ear a phrase that translates as, "Remember that you are mortal." The slave and the phrase were not decoration. They were the point. The triumph was not simply a celebration. It was a controlled celebration. A celebration that contained within its own structure the mechanism for preventing the celebration from becoming something else. You got your day. You got the parade and the cheers and the public acknowledgement of what you had done. And, simultaneously, from the moment the procession began, you were being reminded that the day would end, that you would return to private life, that the city cheering you belonged to Rome, not to you. The triumph was how Rome said, "We see you, we honor you, and now we take the honor back." By 534, the triumph had not been performed in its full traditional form in Constantinople for several generations. The ceremony had faded as the empire changed. What remained was a modified version, a ceremonial procession that retained the visual language of the old form while existing in a different political context. Justinian gave Belisarius a triumph, the first time in perhaps a century that anything close to the full ceremony had been performed. The procession moved through the streets of Constantinople on a clear, warm day. Belisarius came through at the head of his soldiers. Behind him came Gelimer in chains, the former king of a kingdom that no longer existed. Behind them came the treasury, gold and silver and objects that had been in Vandal hands for 100 years. Now returning to Constantinople, the crowd was enormous. The crowd was loud. It had been saying the name Belisarius for months as the reports from Africa arrived. And now it was saying it with the specific energy of people who had been anticipating something and are finding that it matches the anticipation. Gelimer walked through the streets of Constantinople and murmured something to himself. Someone close enough to hear reported what it was. Ecclesiastes 18. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Whether this is exactly what he said, or whether Procopius found it too perfect not to include, is a question the sources cannot settle. What is true is that Gelimer had been, by the accounts that survive, a man capable of seeing his situation clearly, even when the situation was his own catastrophic defeat. He had surrendered when surrender was the only rational option. He was walking through a foreign city in chains because the alternative had been dying in a mountain refuge from cold and hunger. He murmured his verse and walked through the cheering streets. The procession arrived at the hippodrome. Justinian was watching from the imperial box. And this is the image that matters. Not Belisarius in triumph. Justinian, watching from above, while Belisarius processed below. Not beside him. Not equal to him. Below him. In the correct position. As was the entire point of the ceremony. The triumph was the empire saying, "You have done something extraordinary. And that extraordinary thing belongs to us. And we are acknowledging it in a way that places it correctly within the hierarchy that makes us what we are." Belisarius approached the imperial box and prostrated himself before Justinian. This was the required gesture. It was the gesture that said, with the full weight of his body against the floor, that whatever he had done as a servant of this man and this throne and this empire. He meant it. This is the thing that makes Belisarius genuinely difficult to explain to people accustomed to stories about great men who secretly chafe against the systems they serve while performing deference. He meant the prostration. It was not concealed ambition wearing the costume of loyalty. He genuinely understood his victories as belonging to the empire and his authority as delegated rather than intrinsic. This was, simultaneously, his greatest virtue and the thing that made him most vulnerable to everything that was coming. There was a senator in the hippodrome that day, from one of the older families, a man who had been watching emperors for a long time. He watched the triumph with the specific attention of someone who has learned to look at what is underneath public ceremonies rather than at the ceremonies themselves. He watched Belisarius process. He watched Gelimer murmur his verse. He watched the treasury go by. Then he watched Justinian in the imperial box. He had seen pleased emperors before. He knew what pleased looked like. Justinian was pleased. The victory was real. The ceremony was magnificent. The political message it sent to every king and chieftain on the empire's borders was exactly the message Justinian wanted to send. But underneath the pleasure, or alongside it, in a way that did not displace it, but existed simultaneously, was something else. Something the senator recognized without being able to fully name. The look of a man watching something he had authorized, watching it go exactly as planned, and noticing in the going exactly as planned something he had not quite planned for, not a specific concern, not a specific fear, a quality of attention that was different from the uncomplicated attention of someone watching their own success. The senator went home that evening and said nothing about what he had seen to anyone. He had learned, in a long life at the court of Justinian, that observations of this kind were safest when they remained inside the person who made them. He went to bed. He thought about the face in the imperial box. He did not sleep well. In the palace that night, Justinian worked through the documents on his desk. At some point in those hours, in the margins of a planning document, he made a notation about the next phase of the restoration project. The notation concerned Italy. It noted that the African campaign had demonstrated the full range of Belisarius's capabilities. It noted that those capabilities made him the obvious choice for the Italian theatre. It said one other thing, briefly, in a tone more personal than the surrounding text. It said that the success in Africa would require careful management going forward, not the military success. The general, what Justinian meant by careful management, is not explained. The notation does not elaborate, but the word choice is precise in the way that Justinian's word choices were always precise. He was not worried about what Belisarius had done. He was thinking about what Belisarius might become. The triumph was over. Tomorrow there would be meetings about Italy. Belisarius was already thinking about Italy. He had finished one thing and was already moving toward the next, because that was how he was built. And because there was always a next thing, and because the empire had decided it needed him to do it, the shadow, the triumph cast, was just beginning to take shape. Neither of them could see it clearly yet. They would. There is a difference between a campaign and a war. A campaign has a shape. It has a beginning you can identify, a middle you can navigate, and an end you can recognize when it arrives. Africa was a campaign. It started when the fleet left Constantinople, moved through a sequence of events, that built toward a resolution, and ended when Gelimer came down from the mountains and surrendered. Clean enough that you could draw it on a map, and the drawing would tell you something true. Italy was not a campaign. Italy was a war. Wars start with the clarity of campaigns. They come with objectives and timelines, and the reasonable confidence that applying sufficient force to a defined problem will produce a defined result. And then they continue past the point where that confidence was justified, and they develop their own logic, a logic that has less to do with the original objectives than with the accumulated weight of what has already been spent, and the very human difficulty of admitting that the spending has not produced what was promised. Belisarius arrived in Sicily in the summer of 535 with a force smaller than what he had taken to Africa. This was not an oversight. It was the result of choices made in Constantinople about competing priorities. The Persian frontier still required attention. The Balkans required attention. The financial and human costs of the African campaign had been substantial. The empire was not unlimited in its capacity to project military force. And Italy, for all its symbolic importance, was competing against other real and immediate demands. Belisarius understood this. He did not argue about it in any form the sources record. He took what he was given and calculated what was possible. What was possible turned out to be more than anyone in Constantinople predicted and less than the situation ultimately required. That gap between what was achievable and what was necessary is the fact that defines everything else about the Italian campaign. Every tactical achievement, every political complication, every year of fighting that followed exists inside that gap. Sicily fell without serious resistance. The island had been loosely held, and its population was largely indifferent to the question of who their nominal rulers were. Belisarius moved through it with the speed and restraint that had worked in Africa. Then he crossed to the mainland, and everything changed. The Ostrogoths were not the Vandals. They had ruled Italy for decades under their greatest king, Theodoric, who had maintained Roman administrative structures, protected the local senatorial class, and governed with enough sophistication that the daily experience of most Italians under Ostrogoth rule was not dramatically different from the experience under the late Western Empire. Theodoric had died years earlier, and the kingdom he had built was struggling with the succession chaos that follows extraordinary leaders who do not produce extraordinary successors. But the Ostrogoths were still organized. They still had a professional military. They still had the ability to resist. Naples took 3 weeks. The sources describe Belisarius spending that time outside the walls, probing the defenses, looking for the seam in the city's resistance. One of his soldiers eventually found an old aqueduct, large enough to allow armed men to move through it into the city. Belisarius used it. Naples fell. But 3 weeks outside Naples was the first signal of something that would define the entire Italian campaign. The geography was harder. The cities were more defensible. The local political situation was more complicated. And the Ostrogoths, once they recovered from the initial shock of the Byzantine invasion, turned out to be considerably more resilient than anyone in Constantinople had estimated. A new Ostrogoth king, named Vitiges, was elected after Naples. Vitiges was not brilliant, but he was determined, and he understood that the threat the Byzantines posed required everything the kingdom had. He gathered his forces and marched south. Belisarius was in Naples when the reports arrived about the size of the force coming toward him. He did the calculation. Then he marched to Rome. The city's Gothic garrison had retreated north to join Vitiges's main force, leaving Rome thinly held. The population, a complicated mixture of people who had lived through enough changes of government to be primarily interested in surviving the next one, was divided about what to do when Byzantine forces appeared at the gates. The decision was made for them. In December of 536, on a cold morning that Procopius describes with the specificity of a man who was there, the gates of Rome opened for Belisarius. He rode through them into a city he had been fighting toward for months. What he saw was not what the idea of Rome had prepared him to see. The forums were still there. The triumphal arches still stood, carved with victories centuries old. The temples had been repurposed into churches or storage or housing for people with nowhere else to go. The infrastructure of an ancient civilization was visible in every direction. But the city had perhaps 30,000 people, maybe fewer. A population that had once numbered in the millions had contracted to something that barely filled the spaces the old city had been built to contain. Rome was still the most architecturally magnificent place in the Western world. It was also a city that had shrunk so far inside its own walls that the walls no longer made sense as a perimeter for what they enclosed, like a child wearing a parent's coat, with the collar drooping and the sleeves too long, communicating through its very fit the distance between the person wearing it and the person it was made for. There was an old priest who had a small church near the Forum of Trajan. He had been born in Rome, had spent his entire life there, had watched the city through Odoacer and through the whole of Ostrogoth rule. He was not a political person. He had survived by being useful and quiet, and by understanding that his job was to maintain his institution through whatever governments came and went. He watched the Byzantine soldiers come through his neighborhood on the morning of the arrival. They were well-behaved, organized. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of soldiers, executing a plan rather than the chaotic energy of men who had been given permission to take what they wanted. He stood at the door of his church and thought about what it meant that they were here. He had heard the language of restoration, the proclamations about liberating Italy from occupation, returning legitimate Roman authority, completing the great project of reunification. He had read those documents and listened to those arguments with the attention of a man who had spent decades watching the gap between what institutions said and what they actually did. He had watched Rome function under Ostrogoth rule. The administration had continued. The law had been enforced. His church had operated. The senatorial class had maintained its position. The practical daily experience of most people in the city had not been dramatically transformed by the fact that the men with final authority were Goths rather than Romans. What was being restored? Exactly. He did not ask this out loud. Asking it out loud would have been imprudent in ways that a man who had survived this long understood clearly. But he thought it, standing in the door of his church. Then he went back inside and prepared for the work of the day. Because the work of the day was what there was, Belisarius set up his command and began to prepare for what was coming. Because Vitiges was coming, with an army that the sources estimate at numbers that are certainly inflated, but that communicated the basic reality clearly enough. He was bringing everything the Ostrogoth kingdom had to take back a city that Belisarius had occupied with a force that was, by any conventional military assessment, insufficient to hold it against a serious siege. The letters from Constantinople were not helpful. Justinian wrote that reinforcements were being organized. He wrote that the situation was being monitored. He wrote with the language of an administrator managing multiple competing priorities, which was exactly what he was. What Belisarius needed was not language. He wrote back. He described the military situation. He described what he had and what he needed. He asked for specific things in specific quantities. He waited for the answers. The answers came slowly and addressed the questions incompletely. He went to work with what he had. Vitiges arrived in the spring of 537 and surrounded the city. The Ostrogoth camps stretched across the Campagna in a ring that, when Belisarius looked at it from the walls, communicated a single clear message through the simple fact of its size. They intended to wait. The siege began in March of 537. Vitiges cut the roads. He cut the supply lines. He cut the connection between Rome and the rest of Italy and the sea, and every source of the things a city needs to survive when it cannot feed itself. The mathematics of a siege like this are straightforward. You surround a city, you cut its supplies, and you wait. The population eats through its stored food. The food runs out. The city surrenders. This was how sieges worked. This was how they had always worked. Vitiges had the numbers to make the mathematics work. Belisarius had something harder to quantify. He refused to accept the siege on its own terms. From the first days, he used his cavalry in constant sorties outside the walls. Small raids against the Ostrogoth camps that were fast and unpredictable and designed to inflict real casualties while disrupting the Goth supply and communication systems. He was not trying to break the siege with these operations. He was trying to make the siege more expensive than Vitiges had calculated it would be, to transform the mathematics of patient waiting into a shared cost that both sides were paying. He was also writing letters. They went to Constantinople. They described the military situation with precision. They described what he had and what he needed, and the specific gap between those two numbers in terms that were, by the standards of official imperial correspondence, unusually direct. He needed men. He needed food. He needed money to pay the soldiers he had, who were beginning to notice that their payments were arriving late. Constantinople sent responses that acknowledged the situation and indicated that resources were being organized. The resources arrived in quantities that were real but insufficient. Enough to continue. Not enough to change the fundamental equation. Inside Rome, the population he was defending was not uniformly grateful. The people of Rome had not been consulted about whether they wanted this particular form of liberation. A city under siege cannot feed itself normally, cannot conduct its commerce, cannot maintain the rhythms of daily life that make daily life bearable. The shortages were real. The fear was real. The constant background noise of a military operation being conducted through and around the city was destroying what remained of the already fragile fabric of ordinary existence. Some of them had spent 60 years accommodating themselves to Ostrogoth rule. Some had connections to the Goth population, commercial or personal, that made the Byzantine arrival complicated in ways the official ideology had no categories for. Some simply wanted the fighting to stop, in whichever direction that required, because the fighting was the thing that was killing them right now. Belisarius understood this. He did not have a solution for it. The solution was to end the siege quickly. And ending the siege quickly required resources he did not have. He held the walls. There were 14 major towers along the Aurelian Wall, and each of them required constant attention, constant repositioning of the defenders to respond to whatever the Goths were pressing on any given day. Belisarius moved through the city continuously, appearing at the points of pressure before the pressure became critical, making the adjustments that kept the line intact. He slept very little. He ate what the soldiers ate. This was not sentiment. It was the same logic he had applied in Africa about the argument an army makes through its behavior. An army whose general ate the same increasingly scarce food they ate understood something about its general that no speech could convey as efficiently. One night, deep in the siege, somewhere in the long stretch of weeks, that all began to resemble each other. Belisarius climbed to the top of one of the wall towers and stood there alone. The Goth fires were visible across the Campagna, hundreds of them, stretching out in the darkness in every direction. He could see, or thought he could see, the rough shape of the camps, the distances between them, the places where the line was thick and the places where it was thinner. He had walked these calculations so many times that he could run them almost without thinking. The city was behind him. He turned and looked at it, Rome at night, under siege, with a fraction of the population it had been built for. The old buildings were visible even in the darkness, massive and silent. The accumulated architecture of 5 centuries of imperial will, standing over a city that was trying to survive the winter with empty granaries and soldiers who had not been paid in 2 months. He had been sent here to restore Rome to the empire. He was standing inside it. He had held it for months against an army he had no right to hold it against. For an emperor who was at this moment in a palace in Constantinople, working through the night on legal texts, he thought about the letters, the precise requests, the insufficient responses, the gap between what the situation required and what was being sent. He thought about the men on the walls who had not asked for this posting and who were here because the empire needed them here and who had families somewhere, in Thrace or Africa or Asia Minor, who were waiting for news that was not arriving. He thought about a question he had not allowed himself to examine directly before now. Was the thing he was holding actually there? The buildings were there. The walls were there. The name was there. Rome, the name that had organized the world for 5 centuries, that gave the empire its identity and its justification and its explanation for why everything it did was necessary and correct. But the thing that had made Rome, Rome, the million people and the grain and the water and the working institutions and the lived civilization that had given those buildings their meaning, that was gone. It had been going for a long time. What remained was the record of it, preserved in stone, because stone is very good at preserving records. He was holding a ghost, for a man who needed the ghost to be real. He stayed on the tower for a long time. Then he came down. He went to the next problem, because there was always a next problem. And the next problem was the only thing that was genuinely available to him right now. The siege lasted 14 months. 14 months of sorties and supply crises, and the internal politics of a city where multiple factions had multiple different ideas about how the situation should be resolved. 14 months of letters to Constantinople that were precise and direct and received responses that were warm and insufficient. 14 months of soldiers who kept fighting because the man asking them to fight was visibly in the same situation they were in, eating the same food, sleeping the same hours, standing on the same walls. In one of his letters from late in the siege, a letter that has survived in a form that makes its directness remarkable across 15 centuries, Belisarius wrote to Justinian that he could not hold Rome indefinitely without what he had been asking for. He wrote that the men who had fought through the siege deserved to have their sacrifices honored with the resources required to make those sacrifices mean something. He wrote it in the correct language, with all the appropriate forms of deference, but underneath the forms, the message was plain. I am holding Rome for you. Make it possible for me to keep holding Rome for you. If you cannot do that, understand what will happen next. Justinian sent reinforcements, not as many as requested, but enough to shift the equation slightly. The Goths attempted to resupply their own forces and failed. A series of military reverses in other parts of Italy weakened their position. In March of 538, exactly 1 year after the siege began, Vitiges negotiated and the Ostrogoth army withdrew. Belisarius stood on the walls and watched them go. He had held Rome. He had done it with inadequate forces, against a substantially larger army. For over a year, he had done it at considerable cost to the people inside the walls, and considerable personal cost to himself and his soldiers. He had written the letters and received the insufficient responses, and made the insufficient responses work anyway. He had held Rome. He went down from the walls. There was more Italy to take. He went to take it, but something had settled into him during those 14 months that was not there before. Not bitterness. He was not a bitter man. Not doubt about what he was doing or why. Something quieter than that. The knowledge, now confirmed by experience rather than just understood in theory, that the empire he was serving and the empire that existed in Justinian's imagination were not entirely the same thing. That the Rome he had just defended and the Rome that Justinian needed to believe in were related, but distinct. He had held a ghost. He had held it well. He wondered, going down from the walls, how many more times he would be asked to hold it. He would find out. He was about to find out. By the spring of 540, Belisarius had been in Italy for 5 years. 5 years of a war that kept refusing to end on the terms that would have made it a clean victory. 5 years of taking cities that required leaving garrisons that then required defending. 5 years of letters to Constantinople that asked for specific things and received responses that acknowledged the asking. 5 years of soldiers who had been away from home long enough that home had become an idea rather than a memory. He had pushed north through the Italian peninsula, city by city, against Ostrogoth resistance that had adapted after the failure at Rome and was no longer offering the kind of open engagements that Byzantine cavalry could win quickly. The war had ground down into the shape that long wars take when neither side can deliver the decisive blow that would end it. And now he was outside Ravenna. Ravenna sat at the edge of a marshy coastal plain in northeastern Italy, surrounded by terrain that made direct assault extraordinarily difficult. It had been the capital of the Western Empire in its final years. It had passed to Odoacer, and then to Theodoric, and then through the succession chaos that followed Theodoric's death. It was where Vitiges had retreated after Rome. It was the last significant Ostrogoth stronghold. Taking Ravenna would mean something. The siege lines were being established when a message arrived from inside the city. Procopius records what the message contained. The Gothic nobility, or at least a significant faction of it, was willing to consider an arrangement, not a simple surrender to Byzantine authority. Something different. They would accept Belisarius as ruler of the West, not as a Byzantine general administering conquered territory on behalf of a distant emperor, as something closer to a Western emperor himself. In the tradition of the title that had existed before 476, and that had been, in the official Byzantine position, illegitimately vacant ever since. They would open the gates if he would rule what was inside them as his own. Procopius describes what followed with a careful neutrality that does not quite conceal the magnitude of what he is describing. He notes that Belisarius appeared to accept the offer. He notes that the gates were opened and the city surrendered. He notes that once Belisarius was inside Ravenna, he made clear that the surrender was to the Emperor Justinian and not to himself personally, and that the Gothic expectations were not going to be met. The city fell without a siege. This is where the sources leave you with a question that cannot be answered. What actually happened in the weeks of negotiation before Ravenna's gates opened? Did Belisarius genuinely intend to accept the offer and change his mind once he was inside? Did he use the offer as a stratagem from the beginning, pretending to accept in order to get inside the city without paying the cost of a full siege? Did something more complicated happen? Some genuine ambivalence that resolved itself in the moment, when the choice became real and concrete rather than theoretical? The sources do not say. Procopius, who was there, and who would later write two very different accounts of these events, does not tell you what Belisarius thought or felt or intended in the nights before Ravenna's gates opened. He tells you what happened externally. The interior is absent, and the interior is the thing that matters. There was a Gothic officer, a man who had fought against Belisarius for 5 years, and who had been present for the negotiations, who observed Belisarius in Ravenna in the days after the city fell. He had spent 5 years on the losing side of a military contest conducted at very high level. He understood, with the understanding that comes from being consistently outmaneuvered, what kind of commander he had been fighting. He had seen the operations at Rome. He had watched the decisions that were made and the overall shape of a campaign directed by someone operating at a level most commanders never reached. He expected to see a victor in Ravenna, the specific quality that victory produces in certain kinds of men, the expansion, the sense of arrival, the way winning confirms something about who they are. Belisarius did not look like that. He looked like a man who was thinking about something the victory had not resolved, something that was not about the city he had just taken or the king he had just captured. The Gothic officer watched him for several days before the departure orders came and the Byzantine command began organizing for the return to Constantinople. He thought about the offer that had been made and the answer that had come back. He thought about what kind of man, standing inside the gates of a city that had just offered him a crown, gave back that specific answer. He could construct the strategic explanation. A man who understood Byzantine politics would know that a Western emperor, even one sincerely loyal to Justinian, would be an impossible political position to occupy. Justinian would not accept it. The resources that had made the campaigns possible would be withdrawn. The position would be untenable within months. The strategic explanation made sense, but there was something in the way Belisarius moved through Ravenna in those days, something in the quality of his presence in the city, that made the purely strategic explanation feel incomplete. He did not look like a man who had made a strategic calculation. He looked like a man who had been offered something and had found, in the moment of being offered it, that it was not actually what he wanted, that what he wanted, what he had always wanted, was something that the offer was not capable of giving him. The Gothic officer could not name what that something was. He watched Belisarius organize the administration of the conquered city with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything, and he thought about this for a long time, without arriving at a conclusion that satisfied him. Then the letter from Constantinople arrived. Belisarius was recalled, not with explanation, not with the kind of message that would have allowed him to complete the work of establishing genuine Byzantine control over the territory he had just taken, with the urgency that made clear the recall was not optional, and the speed that indicated Justinian did not want him in Italy any longer than was necessary to receive the order and act on it. Belisarius read the letter. He had just taken Ravenna. He had just completed what was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant military achievements of the century. The Gothic king was in custody. The treasury of the Gothic kingdom was being inventoried. The north of Italy was, at least nominally, under Byzantine control for the first time in decades. He folded the letter. He began organizing for the departure. There was no record of what he said, no record of what he showed in his face in the moment of reading, no conversation that a source preserved about what he thought of being summoned home at the exact moment when the work of completing the Italian campaign most needed doing. The silence around that moment is one of the most complete silences in his story, which makes it, in its own way, one of the loudest. He had taken Ravenna. He had been given a crown and returned it. He had done what the empire asked, and more than the empire provided resources for. And the empire's response was to pull him back before the victory could be made permanent. He knew why. He had known for some time that every victory he won added to a calculation happening in Constantinople that had nothing to do with military outcomes. Every battle he survived, every campaign that ended with his name attached to a result that Justinian needed, added to the question that Justinian had been sitting with since Africa. What do you do with a man who keeps winning? What do you do with a man whose soldiers trust him more than they trust the institution he serves? What do you do with a man who has now been offered, by the people he just defeated, a position that you have told yourself is yours by right, but that you have not been able to claim yourself? You call him home. You honor him with the appropriate ceremony. You keep him where you can see him. Belisarius sailed back to Constantinople with vitiges and the Gothic treasury and the reports that would be filed and the triumph that would be organized. Behind him, Italy began immediately to unravel. The Gothic nobility that had accepted Byzantine authority on the basis of his personal presence found that authority considerably less compelling when the person embodying it was gone. New Gothic leaders emerged. The Byzantine officials left in charge did not have the military capacity or the personal authority to hold what Belisarius had established. Within months, the war Belisarius had spent 5 years fighting was not over. It was beginning again. He was in Constantinople, attending the meetings and writing the reports and being celebrated in the formal language of imperial triumph. While the territory his celebration was supposed to represent went back to being contested, the war he had not quite won was waiting for him. He would be back. They both knew it. In the autumn of 541, ships arriving at the port of Pelusium on the Egyptian coast brought something that had no name yet. It would become the plague of Justinian. It was caused by the same bacterium that would produce the Black Death 8 centuries later. In 541, nobody understood what it was or why it spread the way it spread. What they knew was what they could see. People developed swellings in the groin and the armpit. Fever followed. Delirium followed. Death followed, in the majority of cases. Within days of the first symptoms, the disease moved along the same routes that commerce moved along, which, in the Byzantine Empire, meant it moved everywhere. The scale of what it took remains a matter of historical debate. But the world on the other side of it was a different world from the one that entered it. Smaller, more frightened, less certain about the certainties the world before the plague had permitted. Justinian contracted it. In the spring of 542, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire became ill with the plague, and came close enough to death that the question of succession became real and immediate, in the way that abstract questions become when they are no longer abstract. What happened in the palace during the days when Justinian was incapacitated is something the sources describe in fragments. Senior officials began to discuss what came next. This was not treason. It was the responsible behavior of people whose job was to maintain the empire, regardless of what happened to any individual within it. An empire could not simply pause while it waited to learn whether its emperor would survive. The discussions were nonetheless dangerous. Because Justinian survived, he recovered, slowly, and the illness left marks on him that people close to him noticed for the rest of his life. But he recovered, and one of the first things he did, in the early stages of his recovery, was find out what had been said While he was incapacitated, he found out a great deal. Among what he found out was that several military figures, some of them connected to Belisarius's circle, had been involved in conversations about the succession. The conversations were not clearly treasonous. They did not involve specific plans to place anyone on the throne against Justinian's wishes. They were the kind of conversations that people with responsibility for large organizations have when the person at the top is dying. But conversations of that kind, read by a man who had just survived a near-death experience, who had just spent days incapacitated while people around him discussed his replacement, did not remain in the category of responsible contingency planning. They became evidence of something. Justinian did not state publicly what that something was. He addressed it not through direct action, but through adjustment. He adjusted his behavior toward certain people. He adjusted the allocation of resources to certain theaters. He adjusted the degree to which he trusted certain individuals with certain kinds of information. He did not move against Belisarius directly. Not yet. Not in any way that was visible or explicit. But something shifted. There was a secretary in the imperial administration whose job placed him close to the flow of official correspondence. He processed documents, organized files, moved information from the people who generated it to the people who needed to receive it. He was good at his job and careful about what he said he knew, which in the court of Justinian was the distinction between a long career and a short one. He noticed, in the months after Justinian's recovery, that the correspondence concerning Belisarius had changed. The change was subtle. Before the illness, the correspondence had the quality of an emperor communicating with a commander he trusted to exercise judgment in the field. The responses engaged with substance. They made decisions. They allocated resources. After the illness, the responses still came. They were still formally appropriate, but the engagement had changed. More cautious, more hedged, more focused on what Belisarius was reporting, and less focused on what needed to be done in response to it, as if the purpose of the correspondence had shifted from managing a military situation to monitoring the person managing it. The secretary said nothing about this to anyone. The question this shift produced was one Justinian had been circling since Africa, but had never needed to confront directly until now. Because until now, the need for Belisarius had always been clear enough to push the question aside. What do you do with a man you cannot do without and cannot fully trust? A man whose soldiers would follow him through things they would not endure for anyone else. A man who had been offered, by defeated enemies, a crown that was technically yours. A man whose connection to the most significant military achievements of your reign was so direct that the achievements could not be cleanly separated from the man. What do you do with that man? You use him, because the alternative is worse. In Italy, the military situation was deteriorating. A new Gothic king named Totila had emerged, and he was proving to be significantly more capable than Vitiges had been. He was moving fast, striking Byzantine garrisons before they could concentrate, cutting supply lines, offering generous terms to populations that were suffering under Byzantine taxation and were therefore less committed to Byzantine authority than the official restoration narrative required. The cities Belisarius had taken were falling. The dispatches from Italy described not a temporary setback but a structural failure. The resources allocated to Italy after Belisarius's recall had never been sufficient to hold what Belisarius had taken. The assumption had been that establishing Byzantine administration would produce a self-sustaining situation. The assumption was wrong. Totila was proving it wrong. City by city. In Constantinople, Justinian dealt with the plague's aftermath and the Persian frontier and the Balkans and the theological controversies consuming court energy. He worked through the nights, as he always had. He made decisions, as he always had. He thought about Italy. He thought about the question, with no comfortable answer. He thought about the man who was the answer to the question. In the spring of 544, he made a decision. He sent Belisarius back to Italy, not because the trust questions had been resolved, not because the political complications had been addressed, because Italy was falling and Belisarius was what he had, and having him was better than not having him, regardless of the cost. He sent him back, with fewer resources than before, with an understanding, communicated through the official language of the orders, but readable underneath that language by anyone paying attention, that this mission was to stabilize Italy rather than pursue the kind of independent strategic initiative that had characterized the earlier campaigns. Belisarius received the orders. He read them carefully. He understood what they said and what they did not say. Antonina watched him read them. She knew the court well enough to understand the subtext. She knew the difference between being sent to win and being sent so the empire could say it had tried. She packed. She was going with him. She was always going with him. Because the alternative, staying in Constantinople while he went to Italy with inadequate resources under orders, she understood better than he did, was not something she was willing to do. The fleet assembled. Belisarius went back to the war that had not ended while he was away. It was not going to end, simply because he had returned. Wars do not end when the best general arrives. They end when the conditions that made them necessary change. The conditions in Italy had not changed. They had gotten worse. He arrived in Italy in the summer of 544, and understood within days that the situation was worse than the reports had described. This was not a surprise. Reports written by people managing bad situations tend to describe them as bad, but manageable rather than bad and getting worse. Belisarius had spent enough years reading reports from subordinates and writing them to superiors to understand this gap without needing it explained. Understanding it did not make arriving at the actual situation easier. Totila had been campaigning for 3 years and had done it with a strategic intelligence that the Byzantine commanders left in Italy after Belisarius's recall had not been equipped to counter. He had not tried to hold cities in the conventional way, stationing large garrisons that drained his manpower and gave the Byzantines fixed targets. He had taken cities, opened them, demolished their walls in some cases, and moved on, leaving behind populations that were available to support whichever side seemed most capable of providing what populations actually need, which is not ideology, but security and food. Totila understood something the Byzantine approach to Italy had consistently missed. The populations of Italy were people with immediate practical concerns. Byzantine administrators had taxed them heavily because the campaigns were expensive. The people experiencing the taxation were not in a position to appreciate the strategic logic behind it. They were in a position to compare what life under Byzantine administration felt like to what life under Totila felt like. The comparison was not consistently favorable to Justinian. Belisarius looked at this and understood it. The understanding did not produce optimism. He wrote to Justinian, direct in the way his letters always were, but with a quality that went beyond the previous dispatches. He described what he had found. He described what was needed to change it. He described, in specific terms, the relationship between the resources available and the results that could be achieved with those resources. He said he could not do what was being asked with what he had been given. The response took weeks to arrive. It expressed confidence in his abilities and indicated that resources were being directed toward Italy as circumstances permitted. It sent confidence. It did not send men. He set the letter aside and went back to work. There was a young officer in his command, a man from one of the Anatolian provinces in his mid-20s, assigned to Belisarius's staff for the Second Italian campaign. He had grown up hearing about Africa and the defense of Rome, the way young men with military ambitions grow up hearing about the great operations of the generation before them. He met Belisarius at a staff meeting in Ravenna shortly after the second arrival. The intelligence was obvious. The way Belisarius moved through the information presented, asking the right questions in the right sequence, building a picture from the available pieces, was recognizably the thing the stories described. But there was something alongside it that the stories had not prepared him for, a quality of tiredness that was not physical tiredness, though it was probably that too, a tiredness that had settled into the way Belisarius engaged with the situation, not reducing the quality of the engagement, changing its character. It sounded like a man managing a problem with insufficient tools and doing it anyway because the alternative was not managing it. The young officer filed this away and did his job. The campaign proceeded. Belisarius moved through southern Italy, attempting to stabilize the Byzantine position, recapture what could be recaptured with the forces available, prevent the complete collapse that would make the entire Italian project unrecoverable. He was partially successful. He was not successful enough. The problem was not his decisions. It was a resource gap, and resource gaps do not close through better decision-making. They close when resources arrive. The resources did not arrive. He wrote more letters. They were read in Constantinople by a man dealing with the plague's aftermath and the Persian frontier and the Balkans and the theological controversies consuming court energy. Justinian was doing his best. His best. In 545 and 546 was not enough for Italy. In December of 546, Totila took Rome. He did not destroy it. He took it, held it briefly, and then largely abandoned it. He had made his point. Rome could fall. Byzantine authority in Italy was not permanent. Rome changed hands again shortly afterward. Belisarius reoccupied it. The city had been fought over so many times that the population had contracted further and the physical condition had deteriorated further. You were digging through layers of what Rome had been and what it had become, looking for something solid to put your weight on, and the solid thing kept not being there. Then he asked to come home. This was the significant moment, not a tactical retreat, not a strategic redeployment, a request to be recalled because he had determined that what was being asked of him could not be done with what he had been given. It was the most honest assessment he had ever submitted to Constantinople, because embedded in the request, underneath the formal language and the military reasoning, was an acknowledgement that the previous dispatches had not contained, an acknowledgement of limit, not of his own capability, of what the empire was willing to provide, of the gap between what the situation required and what was being sent, and the fact that no amount of trying harder was going to close it. He had tried harder for a decade in Italy. He was done. Justinian granted the request. In 549, Belisarius left Italy for the second and final time. The war continued without him. Italy would not be fully pacified until 554, when Justinian sent a different commander named Narses with the resources that had never been made available to Belisarius. Narses used those resources to accomplish what Belisarius had been asked to do without them. Narses got the resources. Narses won the war. The young officer who had served on the Second Italian campaign had, by 549, arrived at a more complete understanding of what he had been observing in those staff meetings. It was not the tiredness of a man who had given up. Belisarius had not given up. He had continued to function at the highest level available to him, given what he had to work with. For 5 years of the second mission, in conditions that would have broken men, without his specific combination of capability and will, the tiredness was the tiredness of a man who had been required, year after year, to perform at the level that very good situations demanded while operating in situations that were something else, who had been given the title of the job without the resources of the job and asked to produce the results of the job. It was the tiredness of a man who knew the difference between the problem he had been given and the problem he was being asked to solve. He sailed back to Constantinople. The empire needed him back in the capital. It always needed something from him. Sometime in the 540s or 50s, a man sat down to write a book he intended no one to read while he was alive. The man was Procopius of Caesarea. He was a lawyer by training and a historian by vocation and a political survivor by necessity. And he had spent the most consequential years of his professional life attached to Belisarius's staff, traveling with him to Persia and Africa and Italy, observing the operations of the most significant military figure of the age, from close enough to see the details and distant enough to maintain perspective. He had already written a history of those operations. His Wars is a serious and substantial work, composed in the tradition that goes back to Thucydides, with careful attention to evidence and an attempt at analytical balance. It is not a celebration. It contains criticism and complication and moments that are not simple victories, but it is, overall, a history of campaigns that it treats as significant and worth recording, conducted by people engaged in consequential work. The book he was now writing was different. It is called the Anecdota in Greek, which means things unpublished. Later ages would call it the secret history. The name fits. It was a book that could not be published while any of its subjects were alive, because its subjects were Justinian and Theodora and Antonina and Belisarius, and what it said about them was the kind of thing that resulted in death when the subjects had the power to respond to it. Procopius had the power to write it. He did not have the power to release it. He wrote it anyway. Why? This is the question that matters more than whether the things inside it are true, which is where most readers want to start. The secret history describes Justinian as an agent of evil in terms that are cosmic. It describes Theodora in ways so sexually explicit and relentlessly degrading that various editions across the centuries have either suppressed the relevant passages or treated them as evidence of Procopius's particular pathology. It describes Antonina as a woman who controlled Belisarius through infidelity and the political leverage that the Theodora connection gave her. And it describes Belisarius as a man who was simultaneously a great general and someone who allowed himself to be controlled and humiliated by a wife who did not deserve him. The portrait of Belisarius is more complicated than the portraits of the other subjects. Justinian and Theodora in the secret history are drawn in strokes so broad that the polemical intent is visible on every page. They are not people being described by someone who observed them carefully and arrived at a negative assessment. They are figures being used to embody arguments about corruption and illegitimate power. Belisarius is different. The Belisarius of the secret history is still recognizably the Belisarius of the wars. The military capability is there. The discipline is there. The quality of leadership that made the campaigns what they were is there. Acknowledged, even in a text, trying to diminish most of what it touches. What the secret history adds is a Belisarius who is passive in his domestic life in ways that border on incomprehension, who tolerates things from Antonina that the text frames as humiliating, who is aware of circumstances he should not tolerate and tolerates them anyway. The word the text uses repeatedly and with obvious intention is weak. Now sit with that word for a moment. Procopius had travelled with Belisarius for years. He had seen the man function under pressures that military command at the highest level generates. He had watched the defence of Rome. He had been in Africa. He had seen what Belisarius did in conditions that would have been terminal for commanders of lesser quality. He knew what the word weak meant, and he knew what it did not mean. And he knew that the man he was applying it to was not weak in any of the senses the word normally carried. So what was he doing? One explanation, the simplest, is that he was lying, that the secret history is revenge literature written by a man with grievances, and it should be read as propaganda rather than history. There is something to this, but the explanation is incomplete, because the secret history is not consistently wrong in the way that pure propaganda tends to be. A man writing only to destroy his enemies would have made them more consistently villainous. Procopius's Justinian and Theodora are cartoons. His Belisarius is not. The Belisarius of the secret history is a man being described by someone who knew him well enough to see the things the official record does not capture, and who chose to frame those things in the most damaging available interpretation, but who could not quite make himself present a person he knew as someone he did not know. What comes through, underneath the framing and the selection and the interpretive choices doing specific work in the text, is something that looks like grief, not sentimental grief. The specific grief of someone who had placed a great deal of himself in a relationship with a person and an enterprise, and had found, over years and across difficult circumstances, that the relationship and the enterprise had not been what he needed them to be. Procopius had believed in what Belisarius was doing. He had believed in it enough to go to war with him multiple times and to write about those wars with the seriousness the wars demonstrates. He had been there for the extraordinary moments and the difficult ones, and the moments when what was being attempted seemed genuinely larger than anything attempted in a long time. And then something changed. What changed? Exactly, is not something the sources resolve. There are obvious candidates. The accumulated frustrations of a long war that did not end cleanly, the political complications of the court, the specific dynamics of the Belisarius household that Procopius observed from close range and described with a specificity that suggests real knowledge, even if the interpretation of that knowledge is contested, whatever the specific cause. The result was a man who sat down to write about the people he had known best in his professional life, and produced a portrait that was the negative of the portrait he had already published. The same people, the same events, the opposite evaluation. He could write the triumph, or he could write the bitterness. He could not write both, so he published the triumph and hid the bitterness, and then hid the bitterness anyway, because the bitterness was true, and the truth, even when you cannot publish it, requires somewhere to live. The book sat in its hiding place. Belisarius went on with his life, not knowing it existed. Here is what the existence of the secret history actually tells us. Setting aside the specific claims it makes about specific people, it tells us that the experience of being close to Belisarius, of watching him operate from the inside, of believing in what he was doing, and then having the full, complicated reality of what it cost and what it produced press itself against that belief, was an experience that required somewhere to go. The wars was not big enough to hold it. The official record was not honest enough. So, Procopius made something that was honest in the way that things written for no living audience can be honest. Stripped of the considerations that shape everything written for people who are still here and still capable of response. He wrote the grief. He hid it. He died without releasing it. The book survived him. It circulated quietly, as dangerous texts do, among people who understood its value and its danger. It was copied and passed forward and eventually delivered into the hands of scholars who have been arguing about it ever since. He had written Belisarius twice. The first time, for the world. He had written the general who won Africa and held Rome and very nearly restored the Western Empire. The second time, for no one he expected to be alive to read it. He had written something closer to the full weight of what that campaign had actually felt like from the inside. Neither version is complete. The complete version would require holding both at the same time. The extraordinary capability and the real cost. The genuine achievement and the genuine grief. That version Procopius could not write. Because writing it would have required him to be honest about something that neither of his books was honest about. End quote. That the enterprise was worth it and also cost too much. That Belisarius was extraordinary and also trapped. That the empire was real and also failing. That all of these things were true at the same time. And that living inside all of them at the same time was what those years had actually been. He could not hold all of it. He split it into 2 books and hid one of them. And the one he hid, the bitter one, the one written in the dark for no one, outlasted the one he published by 1,500 years of argument. That is its own kind of answer to the question of which one was more true. 559. 3 years before the accusation that would strip him of his property and his bodyguard and his position, 3 years before the moment that would confirm, in the most official and irreversible way available to a Byzantine emperor, what the court had been circling for decades. But that is still 3 years away. Right now, it is winter, and the Kutrager Huns, under a leader named Zabagan, have crossed the frozen Danube and are moving through Thrace toward Constantinople. This was not an unprecedented event. The peoples of the steppe moved against the Byzantine frontier with a regularity that the empire had spent generations learning to manage. But 559 was not a typical year. The plague had thinned the frontier garrisons. The resources that would normally have maintained the defensive infrastructure along the Danube had been redirected, year after year, to the Italian war and the Persian frontier, and the dozens of other pressing demands that an empire with finite resources and infinite obligations generated continuously. Zabagan's calculation was correct. The frontier was weaker than it had been. The force available to respond to a serious incursion was smaller than it needed to be. He moved fast. He pushed deep into Thrace. He sent a detachment toward Greece. He sent another toward the long walls that protected the approaches to Constantinople itself. The detachment heading for Constantinople came close enough that the city could see what was coming. Justinian was in his late 70s. He was still working, still the most intellectually active presence in the court, still driving the projects that had defined his reign. But he was nearly 80, and this was not the kind of crisis that a man nearly 80 who was also managing an empire could easily absorb. He needed someone to handle it. He called Belisarius. Belisarius was in his mid-50s at this point, somewhere between the end of the Second Italian mission and the beginning of the events that would lead to the accusation. He was not in active military command. He had not been in active military command for several years. He was present in Constantinople in the way that men of his rank were present when they were no longer at the center of events, attending meetings and writing assessments, and being available. The call came. He answered. What he had to work with was small in a way that was almost stark in comparison to the resources of the earlier campaigns. Several hundred cavalry from his own household troops. Additional volunteers. Some of them veterans who came when they heard the name attached to the command. Some local men who could ride. Organized quickly, without the proper training time that organizing cavalry required. He took what he had. He moved toward the Couturier detachment, threatening Constantinople. There was a young soldier from one of the Thracian farming communities who could ride adequately and who had heard, when the call for volunteers went out, the name that everyone in the region, with any memory of the last 30 years, had heard. He volunteered because the name was attached to the call. Because that name had a specific meaning in the military culture, he had grown up on the edges of something between legend and ordinary reputation. Something that did not reduce cleanly to either. He joined the improvised force and spent the operation in the role that junior volunteers occupy, receiving orders and executing them, and observing the commander from the respectful distance that hierarchy required. What he observed was not what he had expected. He had expected something larger. The stories he had heard about Africa and Rome had a quality of scale to them. Events and decisions happening at a magnitude that exceeded ordinary human dimensions. He had expected to see that magnitude in person. The man giving orders from horseback on a cold morning in Thrace was not that. He was a man in his mid-50s, who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this kind of thing many times, who knew exactly what he was asking for and why, who made decisions the way people make decisions when the decision-making has become so ingrained that it operates below the level of conscious effort. He was very good. The young soldier could see that clearly from his junior position. The decisions made sense, in ways that the orders of other commanders did not always make sense. The whole shape of the operation had a logic to it, a coherence between the parts that was visible even from where he was standing. But he was not the legend. He was a man, after 3 days of operations. Zabergan's detachment was turned back. The threat to Constantinople receded. The crisis was resolved by a force that should not, by any reasonable military assessment, have been sufficient to resolve it. When the operation was over and the force was dispersing, the young soldier found himself, by the particular accident of geography that produces these moments, close enough to Belisarius to see his face clearly. He had expected, after the success, something, the quality that a man carries when he has done what he set out to do, a settling, a completion. What he saw was a man who was already somewhere else, not in the sense of distraction, in the sense of a person for whom the thing just completed was already behind him, already filed in whatever internal system he used for completed things, and who was looking ahead at whatever came next, not with eagerness, not with the appetite of a man hungry for the next challenge. With something quieter than that, the young soldier looked at that face for a moment. Then the crowd shifted, and Belisarius was gone, back into the cluster of officers around him. The young soldier rejoined his unit. He thought about the face for a long time afterward. In the years that followed, when he heard about the accusation, and then the restoration, and then the death, he had seen great men before, or men who were called great, and the thing he associated with greatness was a self-consciousness about it, a sense that the person carrying the reputation knew they were carrying it, and that the knowing was part of who they were. The face he had seen on that morning in Thrace did not have that quality. It had something else, something he came back to again and again, without quite naming. He eventually arrived at a description that satisfied him. though he recognized it was incomplete, the face of a man who had decided, at some point, so long ago, that the decision had stopped being a decision and had become simply the shape of who he was. That the work was the answer to every question, the work raised, not because the work was good enough to justify everything it cost, because the work was what there was. He went home. He lived his life. He did not forget the face. Constantinople, 562. Belisarius was somewhere in his mid to late 50s. The sources are not precise about his birth year, which is typical for people who became important through their own actions rather than being born into importance. What the evidence does not dispute is that by 562, he was an old man by the standards of a century in which the body was asked to do things that no body was designed to sustain indefinitely. He had spent 40 years in military service. He had come back from the Second Italian mission 13 years earlier. In those 13 years, he had served in the way that men serve, when they are no longer at the center of events, but are still available when the center needs something the people currently at it cannot provide. The defense against Zabagan 3 years earlier was the most visible of those occasions. But there had been others: advisory roles, administrative capacities, the presence at court that a man of his stature was expected to maintain. He was not ignored. He was not treated as someone discarded. He was simply no longer the instrument. The empire had other instruments now, or believed it did, or needed to believe it did. Then, in 562, he was accused. The accusation concerned a conspiracy, specifically a conspiracy against the emperor. The details that have survived are thin and in some places contradictory, which is characteristic of accusations of this type in this period, where the evidentiary standards were different from what modern legal systems would recognize, and where the political utility of an accusation sometimes mattered more to the people making it than its factual basis. The accusation said that Belisarius had been involved in a plot threatening imperial authority. Justinian took action. The action was swift and significant. Belisarius's bodyguard was dissolved. The personal military force that a commander of his rank maintained, the men who had served with him through years of shared hardship and who owed him the loyalty of that history, was removed from his control. His properties were seized. His household was placed under a form of supervision that made clear that the freedom he had previously enjoyed was no longer being extended. He was not imprisoned. He was not tried in any formal public proceeding. He was not executed. He was diminished, precisely and carefully diminished, in ways that communicated exactly what had happened, without requiring anyone to state it in terms that would appear in an official record as a judgment. There was a functionary in the imperial administration whose job was to process the documentation that accompanied actions of this kind. He was not a senior official. He was one of the hundreds of people who kept the machinery of the Byzantine state running by doing the specific tasks the machinery required. Seizure orders, transfer of property documentation, the administrative paperwork that an empire generates when it moves against one of its own. He received the documents concerning Belisarius and began to process them. The documents were formally correct in every detail. The language was the right language. The authorizations were in the right places. The procedures were being followed in the correct sequence. He had processed documents like these before, for other people. In other situations, he worked through the Belisarius documents with the same attention he brought to everything. At some point in the middle of the processing, he stopped. He looked at the name at the top of the documents. He did not know Belisarius personally. He had not met him. He knew the name, the way that anyone in Constantinople who had been paying attention for the past 30 years knew the name, as a marker attached to a history that the documents themselves only partially captured. He had processed documents concerning many people: military commanders, court officials, merchants, ecclesiastical figures, people who had been elevated and then reduced with the regularity that the court of Justinian produced. He had learned, in years of this work, to maintain the professional distance that the processing required. He could not quite maintain it here. He sat with the documents and thought about what the name represented. Africa, the Vandal kingdom that had been sitting on Roman territory for 100 years. Gone in less than one. Rome. 14 months of a defense that had no right to succeed, against a force that should have taken the city in weeks. Ravenna. A crown offered by defeated enemies and returned to a distant emperor who had not earned it through anything he personally risked. 40 years. And now a seizure order. The functionary was not in a position to evaluate whether Belisarius was guilty of what the accusation claimed. He had no access to the evidence. Assuming evidence existed. He was a man who processed paperwork, not a man who judged cases. But he understood proportion and what was being done here, whatever its legal justification, was proportionally wrong in a way that most of what he processed was not. Not because of the specific action, because of what the action was being laid against. The weight of what that name had given to the empire that was now reducing its owner to a supervised household and a seized property was a weight that the seizure order did not acknowledge, and that the formal correctness of the documents could not make invisible. He finished the documents. He filed them in the appropriate place. He went home. He did not sleep well that night. He went back to work the next morning and said nothing about what he had thought. He never mentioned it to anyone. In the house where Belisarius was now living under supervision, the daily reality was different from the daily reality of the previous decades, in ways that were hard to fully describe because they were not dramatic. He was not in a cell. He was not in physical danger. He had food and shelter, and the household members who had not been removed in the action against him. What he did not have was what he had always had: purpose, not in the sense of a man who had never thought about anything except military command. He was an intelligent man, with the accumulated experience of a long and consequential life. He could occupy himself. He had things to think about and things to read, and 40 years of events to sit with. But the specific shape of purpose that had organized his existence since he was young enough to enter Justinian's service, the purpose that came from being the person to whom difficult things were brought, because he was the person who could address difficult things, that was gone. Antonina was there. She had not found reasons to be less associated with someone who had fallen out of imperial favor. She had not discovered that the practical consequences of the situation made her presence inadvisable. She was present in the specific way that someone who has chosen, consciously and with full understanding of the costs, to be present is present. She had her connections, maintained across decades of careful attention to the court and the people who mattered in it. She used them with the focused intelligence that had always characterized her engagement with the political world. Whether her efforts made a difference to what happened next is not something the sources allow you to determine with confidence. What happened next was this. 8 months after the initial action against him, Belisarius was restored. The properties were returned. Most of them. The bodyguard was reconstituted. Partially, he was given back the formal rank and the formal position that the accusation had stripped from him. The official record was adjusted to reflect that the matter had been resolved. It was not an apology. Emperors did not issue apologies. It was a restoration. which said the situation that existed before the action is now being reinstated. It did not say the action was wrong. It did not say we regret what occurred. It said, this is now how things are. Belisarius received the restoration in the appropriate way. He expressed the appropriate gratitude. He resumed the appropriate functions. And here is the thing that the restoration did not undo. The accusation had been made. The properties had been seized. The bodyguard had been dissolved. For 8 months, the man who had saved the government 30 years earlier in the Hippodrome, who had taken Africa and held Rome and returned the crown of the West, had lived in a supervised household while the administrative machinery processed documents with his name at the top. That had happened. The restoration did not make it not have happened. What it revealed was something that Belisarius had understood for a long time in the way you understand things that you live with but do not examine directly. Because examining them directly would require looking at what you have built your life around and asking whether the foundation is what you believed it to be. He had given everything to this empire, not as an abstraction, specifically and concretely and repeatedly, over 40 years, in ways that cost him things the empire could not give back and did not try to. And the empire had given him 8 months of supervision and a restoration that was functionally an acknowledgement that the accusation had run its course. He knew this. He had probably known, in some form, for a long time. The knowing had not changed what he did. He had continued to serve and to give and to be what the empire needed when the empire decided it needed him. He had done this not from naivety, not from an inability to see the situation clearly. He had done it because it was what he was, in the deepest available sense. The thing that remained when everything that could be removed had been removed. A man who served, whether this was the greatest thing about him or the most heartbreaking, or both at the same time, in a way that makes separating them a mistake, is the question that his story keeps raising and cannot answer, because it is not really a question about Belisarius. It is a question about what we ask of the people who are best at what the world needs done, and what we owe them in return, and whether the transaction is ever actually fair, and what it means that the people who are best at serving tend to keep serving even when the answer to that last question is clearly no. The house returned to its routines. Antonina organized the household. Belisarius resumed his functions. The empire continued. It was 563. He had 2 years left. He did not know that. He went to the meetings he was expected to attend, wrote the assessments he was expected to write, was present in the way that a man of his position was expected to be present. He was not bitter. The sources do not record bitterness in him at any point. Not after the recalls from Italy, not after the accusation, not after the restoration. That was not quite what a restoration should be. He was tired, in the specific way that had been visible since the Second Italian campaign. But he was not bitter, which was, depending on how you looked at it, either the most admirable thing about him or the most heartbreaking, or both. At the same time, in proportions that shifted depending on the day and the angle from which you were looking. Istanbul. Today, walk through the door of the Hagia Sophia on a morning when the light is coming in at the right angle and something happens to you before you have time to prepare for it. The dome sits 180 feet above the floor, and it does not look like it is being held up by anything. The windows at its base let in light that dissolves the boundary between the structure and the sky above it. The mosaics that survived the Ottoman conversion and the centuries of whitewash and the earthquake damage and the fires and everything else a building accumulates across 1,500 years of continuous use catch that light, and hold it, with the specific quality of surfaces made by people who understood that what they were making would outlast them. The name associated with this building is Justinian. It is his building. He commissioned it. He drove it to completion. He stood in it when it was finished and said, according to the sources, that he had surpassed Solomon. Belisarius's name is not on the building. This is not an oversight. Belisarius did not build Hagia Sophia. Justinian built it. Or rather, Justinian directed the architects Anthemius of Thrace and Isidore of Miletus to build it, and provided the resources, and made the decisions that made it possible, and takes the credit the building generates across the 15 centuries since its completion. What Belisarius did was make the credit available to take the Nika revolt, which Belisarius suppressed at a cost that no one recorded and that Belisarius never discussed, destroyed the first Hagia Sophia. Without the suppression, Justinian might not have survived to build anything. The African treasury, whose gold Belisarius returned to Constantinople, funded the building program that defined the reign. Without the campaigns in Africa and Italy, however incomplete their resolution, the claim to legitimacy that allowed Justinian to present himself as the restorer of Roman civilization would have been a different kind of claim. The building stands because of what Belisarius made possible. His name is not on it. This is not unusual. The people who make things possible rarely have their names on the things they make possible. The names go to the people who decide. The people who execute recede into the background of the record, which is organized around decisions rather than execution. Because decisions belong to individuals, and execution belongs to systems, and systems do not generate the kind of narrative that names attach to. Belisarius was a system. He was also a man. The tension between those two facts is the tension that runs through everything in his story, and that the story never resolves. Because it is not the kind of tension that resolves. It is the kind you carry, walk out of Hagia Sophia, and turn south, and walk for 20 minutes through streets that have been streets for a very long time, through neighborhoods that have existed under different names, and different governments, and different languages, and you will arrive at the area where the hippodrome stood. The hippodrome is mostly gone. What remains is a long open space that follows the shape of the old racing track without being the track itself. 3 monuments survive in the center: the Egyptian obelisk, and the serpent column, and the column of Constantine, standing where they stood when the hippodrome was the place where the emperor and the people negotiated their relationship through the medium of chariot races and organized noise. In January of 532, Belisarius went through one of the entrances of this space with soldiers behind him. He did what was asked of him. The empire was saved. The stone does not record this. The stone records what was built around it. The monuments Justinian left, standing as markers of the space, without recording what happened in the space at the cost that the preservation of the space required. This is what stone does. It holds what is put into it. It does not hold what is left out. And the things left out of official records are left out by choice, by the people who control the records, which in this case was a man who understood the relationship between history and power, with the sophistication of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking about it. In the museums that preserve what remains of the Byzantine world, there are objects that Belisarius touched or commanded or made possible. Coins from the African treasury he returned to Constantinople. Administrative documents recording the movements of his armies and the allocation of resources under his authority. His name appears in these documents in the way that functionally important names appear in administrative records, with precision and without sentiment, noting his position and his responsibilities and the actions taken under his authority. The documents are fragmentary. Some were lost to fire and flood and political disruption. Some were preserved by the same accidents that destroyed others. The archive of this period is full of gaps where there should be text, missing pieces that would answer questions the surviving pieces raise. The gaps in the record of Belisarius are larger than the gaps for most people of his stature. Some of those gaps are natural, some are not. There is a painting in the Louvre in Paris, Jacques-Louis David, made it in 1780, which is more than 1,200 years after the events it depicts. It shows Belisarius as an old man, blind, seated outside a city wall with his hand extended. A soldier recognizes him and his face breaks open with horror and grief. A woman drops a coin into the helmet he holds. The light falls in the way that historical paintings of the period used light to communicate moral weight. The painting is beautiful. It depicts something that almost certainly never happened. The story of Belisarius blind and begging did not circulate in anything close to that form until centuries after his death. It was the product of the medieval and Renaissance imagination, working on the material of his life and producing, from that material, a narrative that felt true in the way that narratives feel true when they capture something essential about a situation, even while inventing the specific details. What the story captures is the emotional logic of his life as the people who came after him perceived it. A man of that capability, having served that faithfully for that long, should not have ended the way he ended. The ending the official record provides. The restoration after the accusation. The quiet death in 565, the same year as Justinian, without the conclusive vindication that the shape of the story seems to require, is not an ending that satisfies the human need for proportion between what was given and what was received. So the imagination provided a different ending, not a better one, a clearer one, an ending where the injustice is visible and legible, where you can see exactly what was taken and from whom, where the accounting is explicit in the way that the actual accounting was not. The painting shows what the story feels like, rather than what the story was. And the feeling is not wrong. The feeling is the accurate part. Belisarius died in March of 565. Justinian died in November of 565. 8 months apart. In the same year, after 40 years in which their lives had been organized around each other in ways that neither of them chose and neither of them was entirely free of, what Justinian thought about Belisarius in the 8 months between the deaths is not recorded. He was 82 or 83 and dying in the slow way that old men die when the systems that have been running for too long begin to wind down. Whether his thoughts in those months included Belisarius, and in what form, is something the sources cannot tell you. What the sources do tell you is that Justinian left Belisarius's name out of the arrangements for his own commemoration. The Great Reign was recorded in the structures it had built and the laws it had reformed and the territories it had restored, and the name associated with all of those things was Justinian's name. The man who made most of them possible is in the secondary sources, in the administrative documents, in Procopius's careful and compromised account, in the spaces between the things that Justinian's name is on. He is in the shape of what was possible. He is in the victories that were taken and called someone else's. He is in the 14 months that Rome stood when it should have fallen. In the specific quality of a defense that had no right to succeed and succeeded anyway. He is in the question that his life keeps generating across the 15 centuries since he stopped being alive to generate it himself. The question is not complicated. It does not require historical expertise to feel its weight. It is the question that any person who has ever worked inside a system larger than themselves has asked in some form. In some quiet moment, when the work is done, and the recognition has gone somewhere else, and the gap between what was given and what was received is visible in the specific way, it becomes visible in those moments. How much can one person give to something before the something owes them a debt it cannot pay? And when the debt cannot be paid, when the accounting between what was given and what was received is permanently and obviously out of balance. What does that mean about the giving? Was it wrong to give that much? Was it a failure of judgment? An inability to recognize what the system was and what it was capable of offering in return? Or was it the truest thing about him? The thing that the system could use, but could not understand? Because the system was built to use things, and what he was doing was something different from being used. Something that looked like being used from the outside, but was, from the inside, something that had its own logic and its own integrity that did not depend on the system's recognition of it. The question does not have an answer that the historical record provides. It has the question. The question has lasted 1,500 years. Walk back to Hagia Sophia. Stand in the light that comes through the windows at the base of the dome and dissolves the boundary between the structure and the sky. The name on this building is Justinian. The man who made it possible to build this building is somewhere in the light, not in any mystical sense. In the practical sense that the resources and the stability and the time that Justinian had to devote to building this, while the frontier was being held and the treasury was being filled, those things came from somewhere. The somewhere was 40 years of work that a man from Thrace poured into an empire that was never quite sure what to do with what he gave it. The light moves through the dome in the same arc it has always moved through. The building holds the weight in the same way it has always held the weight. The hole in the record where his name should be is still there. That hole is also what he gave. He gave what he had. The empire took it. The empire is gone. What he gave is still standing. In Istanbul, on a morning when the light is right, you can walk through the door of Hagia Sophia and feel the dome open above you. The question he left behind is still there. It has been there for 1,500 years. It will be there when we are gone. He put it there, without his name on it. That was always going to be how it went. And he served anyway.